morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank all the audience for coming here at such an early time. I also want to thank the Chalaram team for this wonderful opportunity. The cat is already out of the bag. There's hardly anything to surprise you might think. But I'll still do a little bit of surprise for you during this presentation. I'll be talking about Glimepiride, the Carolina surprise. Let me tell you a story. When I was in first year MBBS, my professor used to ask us in anatomy, boys, what book are you reading? And we used to say Cunningham, sir. And some of us would say R.J. Last or Keithel Moore or even Richard Snell. But the reality is all our bags had only one book, and that was Chaurasia. God bless his soul. Without that book, half of the boys in my class would have failed. As I passed first year and went further and further into DM, I realized that there is a lot of disconnect between what we do and what we say we do. That is perhaps because we are not very confident about the legitimacy of our choices. So whether it is Chaurasia or Glimepiride, our lack of confidence comes from, to some extent, an inability to square the practicality with what the world considers as gold standard. So today, I will try and dispel that myth with the Carolina trial. But before we get into the Carolina trial per se, I'll give you a little bit of the flashback because most of us know what is the surprise. Therefore, it is important for us to know where it all began so that we get to understand the importance of this trial. See, the sulfonylurea timeline starts at 1941, much older than any of us in this room. That was when the hypoglycemic effects were loaded. Tolbutamide was launched in Germany some 15 years later. It was a time of little regulation because the drugs were introduced first and the trials that looked at the drug safety happened later. The UGDP trial was the trial that looked at safety of sulfonylureas, which compared tolbutamide versus fenformin. Now that trial was a complete disaster. What it did was it showed there is an increased risk with both tolbutamide and fenformin. So everything associated with the trial just got struck. The drugs like tolbutamide and fenformin went out of the market. The company which made them went bust. Because it became a complete disaster, the next 40 years of diabetes research was dominated by one thing and one thing only. That was glucose intricity. People started looking at whether the blood glucose is lowering or not whether you're dying out of heart attacks, strokes, or something like that. The idea was quite simple. The gray zone in this thing, it basically tells you that if you're not looking for something, you're not likely to find it. So that was the idea that dominated the next 40 years of diabetes research landscape. And then in 2008, rosiglitazone happened. Nissan and colleagues found that rosiglitazone could be possibly increasing cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. That was a big jolt to the FDA, and the FDA pulled up the companies and told, look guys, you have to do better, that the drugs that you provide must be at least safe for the heart. So that was the era of the CVOTs. That's when the CVOTs happened. Now, if you see this slide, this is a busy slide. I don't want you to read any of these numbers. Basically, what I want you to see is that lots and lots of CVOTs happened. Each one of these CVOTs costs roughly between $300 to $500 million. It's all expensive stuff. But all of them had two things in common. Number one, they were all for newer drugs, GLP-1 analogs, DPP-4 inhibitors, or SGLT2 inhibitors. Number two, all of them were placebo-controlled trials. So that was the thing between 2008 to 2020. Now, why am I harping on this placebo-controlled trial? Does the comparator matter? This is the fight of the century, Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. A fight of equals, a clash of titans. This is the kind of thing that carries an inherent uncertainty. But placebo-controlled trial is like this. I mean, it is like me fighting Mike Tyson or something like that. It makes zero sense. So that is why comparators matter. Because it has an inherent flaw in this, you have to couch it in complex sounding language. For example, my drug achieved non-inferiority in the primary endpoint of 3-point MACE in multinational randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Are you guys impressed? But if I have to say this in English, my drug is not worse than a nothing pill. Now, I'm sure most of you wouldn't be impressed. Imagine proposing to a girl and saying, why should I marry you? I'm better than nothing. I'm sure no girl would marry you like that. So this kind of couching of simple information in complex words had to be done to hide this basic thing. So let's say, okay, we can do a vector study, but what drugs to study? Two commonly used drugs are glimepiride, which is the most commonly used sulfonylurea, and linagliptin is a gliptin that basically puts diabetes management on autopilot mode. You can give it to anybody with any kind of liver disease, kidney disease, heart disease, whatever. So these, if you study this group of drugs, it will cover a large proportion of diabetes patients. But before we study sulfonylureas, we need to know a little bit about their biology. And sulfonylureas have receptors, sulfonylurea receptors 1, 2A, and 2B. And the receptor density, location, all matter to its actions. SUR1 is located in the beta cells, 2A and 2B are located in cardiomyocytes and smooth muscle cells respectively. Because these receptors are located in different places in different densities, their biological actions also varies. Unfortunately, sulfonylureas have had a bad rap because of the UGDP trial. For example, when it comes to other classes of drugs, we distinguish between drug effects and class effects. When you take biguanides, for example, fenformin is bad, but metformin is not. When we take DPP-4 inhibitors, CV neutrality is thought of as a class effect. Saxagliptin may be an exception. When we talk about SGLT2 inhibitors, CV protection is a class effect. A is a drug effect. But we don't give this kind of leeway to sulfonylureas. The bottom line is not all sulfonylureas are created equal. The modern sulfonylureas have more in common with the modern drugs than the older sulfonylureas, and therefore it makes no sense to group them together in one bunch. So still there is a controversy that remained after 51 years of UGDP, that we did not know whether sulfonylureas increase cardiovascular mortality or not, and therefore we were not confident in our choices. What do we need to resolve this controversy? Placebo-controlled trials, if I showed that image, it doesn't make zero sense, otherwise they wouldn't exist in the first place. Placebo-controlled trials tell you how good a drug is compared to a placebo, but also tells you that the drug has placebo-like safety, like it's as safe as a placebo, but it's only a first-line thing. What we need is an active comparator, RCT, to put this drug in relation to others. For example, 5 guys propose to Ramya, let's say. Each guy says, I'm better than nothing. The girl wouldn't be able to decide as long as there is no head-to-head comparison between the guys. So the only way you have is a head-to-head comparison of trials, or you might think they're network comparison meta-analysis, or in a propensity score weighting and other statistical methods can substitute for RCTs, but they are poor substitutes for RCTs, and therefore the only way to answer this question is an active double-blind RCT of long duration, which is why we need a clash of equals, a sort of India-Pakistan match, not India-Afghanistan or something like that. That is what Carolina trial is. Basically, the research question is this: what is the effect of linagliptin compared with glimepiride on major CV events in patients with relatively early type 2 diabetes and elevated CV risk? They took 3,619 men and 2,400 odd women. Median age was 64 years. This is like any other large RCT studied in multiple countries in multiple centers. They gave linagliptin to one group, 5 milligram flat single dose, and glimepiride in another group where it was started with 1 milligram and gradually up-titrated to 4 milligrams. The primary outcome was time to occurrence of CV death, non-fatal MI, or non-fatal stroke. Now these are the results. The cat was already out of the bag. There was hardly any difference between, in fact, those two curves basically sort of overlap each other. No difference between glimepiride and linagliptin when it comes to CV endpoints. This is the same when you take cardiovascular death, non-cardiovascular death, etc. But this is the slide, my favorite slide of this entire talk, which is what I want you to see, because this slide gives you two important surprises. Number one, glimepiride or sulfonylureas in general are thought to be drugs with poor glycemic durability. When you give the drug, there's a sharp reduction in glucose, but over time, the blood glucose starts to climb up. But what you see here is that there is no such climbing up of blood glucose over a period of time. There is a slight undulation, but on the whole, it remains flat throughout a period of 6.3 years. I'm not sure about you, but if a drug at glimepiride's cost can last for 6.3 years without requiring additional drugs, that's a big win for me. The second surprise is that linagliptin and other DPP-4 inhibitors in general, when compared with sulfonylureas, are thought to be weaker blood glucose lowering agents. They have a modest glucose lowering efficacy. So the fact that linagliptin performed as well as maximum uptitrated glimepiride was a surprise in itself. So this graph shows both kinds of surprise, that linagliptin, possibly modest glucose lowering agent, is as good as the most potent sulfonylurea available, and that even the most potent sulfonylurea doesn't lead to beta cell exhaustion or death, and there are no beta cell dead bodies lying around. It's been working for 6.3 years. And when you see that kind of tick mark, a sharp reduction followed by gradual climb in blood glucose, there is no tick mark in this image for up to 6.3 years, a big surprise. So that is the conclusion and relevance of this study. Among adults with relatively early type 2 diabetes and elevated cardiovascular risk, the use of linagliptin compared with glimepiride over a median of 6.3 years resulted in non-inferior risk. Once again, I'm not a big fan of these kind of big sounding words. To state simply, glimepiride is as good as linagliptin for CV safety, while also being much cheaper. So if you think like that, if both drugs are relatively equal, what's the point of buying a drug that's nearly 8 times as expensive? Does linagliptin have any advantage at all? Yes, it does have some tricks up its sleeve. That is shown in this slide. Linagliptin is having a much lower risk of hypoglycemia. Yes. There's a tiny reduction in weight with linagliptin and a tiny increase in weight with glimepiride, but that's 1.5 kgs over 6 years, hardly anything you would write home about. So that is not a big deal of difference, but the hypoglycemia is a big difference between linagliptin and glimepiride. So if adverse effects are the way to choose drugs, sulfonylureas have only one adverse effect, that is the exaggerated effect is its own adverse effect, whereas other drug classes can have non-blood glucose related adverse effects, such as QT prolongation, heart failure, pancreatitis, or genital infections, or other things. So, of course, linagliptin doesn't have many of these, but the fact is that sulfonylurea's adverse effects are essentially tied to its effects itself. It's just an exaggerated effect of the drug. So, take-home messages: not all sulfonylureas are created equal. Glimepiride is as safe as linagliptin for the heart, while also being much cheaper. Hypoglycemia is a trade-off with glimepiride, but then again, it all depends on how well we educate the patients and all that. But finally, I want to end with this slide. This is the group of tribes who have been rendered as criminals by birth during the colonial British era by an act called Criminal Tribes Act. It didn't matter whether they did any crime or anything wrong. The mere fact that they were born in a particular tribe meant that they were criminals. We have come a long way from that era, where we know intuitively that our destiny is tied to our actions and that we cannot be crucified for the sins of our forefathers. We must extend that kind of courtesy to the drugs as well. No drug can inherit glory or damnation because it belongs to any particular class. Those drugs have to be evaluated on their own merits. And when we do that for glimepiride, we can find that it is about as good as any other drug. Thank you for listening. It's a great thing to be here again. Thank you.